And hello. They saved the best for last. And we are going to talk about HITRUST podcast called Trust Versus. But before we get into it, thank you for reaching this point in the conference. We've thinned out only because of travel restrictions, not because of how poor the content is at all. This is great content. This included. I know everyone that's not here is sad about not being able to attend this. I know they looked at the agenda and said, HITRUST has a podcast. I've already listened to it and walked away sad. Anyway, we saved the best for last, and you're so lucky to be here. I'm very happy to be talking about our podcast. What you're seeing on the screen is the QR code. If you want to check out the landing page for it, do check it out. So if you didn't know, we have a podcast called Trust Versus. And what we'll do in this session is kind of talk about how we started and maybe do sort of a highlight reel of our favorite moments from the season. And we just finished wrapping season 1. It had 8 episodes, so you hear a little bit about each episode, why we wanted to talk to the person we talked to, why we wanted to cover the topic that we covered, and maybe have some fun with it. So I think like all of these things, we started with, hey, HITRUST needs a podcast. Well, that sounds like a good idea. And so we were super enthusiastic, right? Me especially, I was like, yes, we need a podcast. We talk about all these big ideas and we have these deep philosophical conversations about assurance and compliance and other nerdy stuff that only the people in this room might appreciate. So I was super happy about not only be able to have those conversations on the mic, but talk about it in this session. Enthusiasm very high. And then we realized maybe this will lead to fame and fortune. No one calmed it down. I was off the hook on the dreams of fame and fortune. We also realized we had no podcast experience whatsoever. And I started listening to other podcasts and realized, I think there's some skill involved that being an ex-auditor, an ex-assessor, it just doesn't translate, right? I could talk to a compliance manager on the other side of the table, but maybe not a person on the other side of the mic. But that's where we started.
But Jeremy, we heard so many bad podcasts when we're like, we can do better, I think.
And like Robert, maybe you listen to less podcasts than I did.
I do. I bet.
Yeah. So what I did was I went out and said, let me find a podcast or two that started and then didn't have an episode 2 or 3. And if you didn't know, there are about 3.5 million podcasts around. Like there's Podcatcher kind of stats that you could look at. 3.5 million podcasts. But there are not 3.5 million successful podcasts. A lot of those start, I think, maybe with equal levels of enthusiasm, and maybe they also realize that, we don't have the necessary skills to do audio editing and script writing and interview scheduling and guest vetting and all those things, and maybe do 1 or 2 and realize, maybe this wasn't for us. So there's a graveyard of enthusiasm and ideas that are still out there on the Apple App Store or the Play Store. And so I found a couple and I gave them to Robert, and it was, I think the title of one of them was, this is the pilot episode for a real podcast, 5 minutes of the most inconsequential airtime ever recorded. And it may have been. But yeah, here we are now. The first full season is available. We have 8 episodes. And we did get help. We actually brought in a professional branded podcast company, Quill, out of Canada. They're great. They helped us a great deal. And with their help and through some trial and error, we have 50,000 unique listeners. As of the time I made the slides a little while ago, we're right near 60. So maybe with the help of this room, we might get to 60,000 downloads, which I think is pretty cool. We even hit the charts. I didn't know they had podcast charts. I don't know if you guys are podcast experts. I was floored when I got my email from Quill, and they were like, congratulations, you hit the big times. The fame and fortune has arrived. And I said, tell me more about that. This is why I'm in this business. We peaked at number 18 on the Apple Technology Podcast ratings. Super proud of that. Thank you. But before you clap anymore, it was in Pakistan.
Compliance is very, very big in Pakistan, obviously.
So we've got some work to do, but I'm still happy with our accomplishments. And we put a lot of hard work into it.
Yeah, it's fun.
I'm really proud of the work that we did on it. Yeah. I think I don't know. I'm a nerd. I like hearing about the stuff we talked about.
Yeah. And we had some incredible guests. I mean, I think that was the thing that was so wonderful about it was our friends and in family, people that we've known for a long time that said, yeah, I could talk about something I'm interested in. And, I think I learned something in every episode, Jeremy. I really did. So
I did too. And so I was pretty nervous about our first one. And what do you do when you're nervous about embarking on something? You bring your friends with you. And at least if you don't do a good job, you did it with somebody else that you can look back on over a beer and say, uh-oh. So we thought about, you know what? Let's talk to David at Microsoft. And David is here. Can we hear it for David? Yeah. So we then had to figure out, what do we start talking about? And HITRUST is an organization. We have a framework. We have a tech platform. We have very interesting customers like the individuals in this room. We have networks with professional services firms. We do a slew of products and services and other professional services stuff. There was not a shortage of ideas that we had. And Robert, do you remember the mind map that I built?
yes.
And I had stuff in there like, what is the history of first cybersecurity regulation ever? What was the landscape like when that first cybersecurity regulation was written? Was it about protecting dial-up modems and war driving, or is that too late? And so I had this whole, that's just one of this enormous mind map that I put together, and I showed it to Robert, and Robert's like, I think we're on a different page. Let's talk about compliance. And so we talked about compliance. But it actually turned out to be a very good starting point. And I make the point in the episode, I think a lot of organizations in their cybersecurity journey start with the need to comply with a particular regulation. Maybe they're in the healthcare space and they say, look, if I don't get HIPAA right, I'm gonna be in a big trouble. I need to maybe build from there. So it kind of makes sense to start here at the risk of only being known as a compliance podcast or a compliance organization. I think it kind of worked out. It fit really well. And so for each episode, we came up with, Quill told us to do these audiograms, which I'd never seen for another podcast. They're like 30-second little commercials. And I didn't know it, but I was supposed to be putting them on my LinkedIn page, like their size for LinkedIn. So I would just go and write this paragraph about how great the episode was and just put the link, and I was doing it all wrong. So anyway, there's the official audiogram for this episode.
It's the key role that information privacy and security compliance plays in healthcare in helping to establish trust and mitigate risk of adverse events and security incidents like breaches, like ransomware, and the things that degrade patient quality of care in a worst case could be a patient safety issue. So to the extent we collaborate on compliance as a tool for healthcare to help them deliver better healthcare, better quality of service, quality of patient care, reduce risk of security incidents and so forth.
So despite my tone of let's have a lot of fun with this, that clip might have sounded like, uh-oh, it's a yet another boring podcast. It's not. Actually, I think we had a very enriching conversation about the role that compliance plays in an organization's sort of infrastructure in their company and what value does it bring? And Robert had a very interesting question. I thought, does compliance make us more secure? And how does compliance and security relate to each other? Does one play off the other? Is one subservient to another? And so let's hear what David had to say about this. And I hope this isn't weird for you, David, to hear your own voice. It was very weird for me to hear my own voice when I had these headphones on. It's a weird thing. Not as weird as if you go to Midjourney, the image generator for AI, and tell it to make an image of you based on what's available on the internet. That's a weird thing. But this was pretty weird too, hearing your own voice. So thanks for letting us play your own voice back to you. Anyway, let's hear what David had to say about this question of, does compliance make us more secure?
I'm going to go back to even a more basic question, does compliance itself make organizations more secure? What's the value? How does it really help?
So in terms of establishing a common standard to ensure adequacy of privacy security controls, I think the risk of not having compliance to an authoritative source, a regulation, a data protection law, an information privacy and security standard, the risk of not having that is people resort to sort of ad hoc techniques, right? Like questionnaires. And whether those questionnaires sufficiently mitigate risk or recognize risk to confidentiality, integrity, availability of healthcare data, that's really a big question mark, and it really depends on who created that questionnaire, and it's such wide variability across organizations. So I think the real value of compliance is establishing that common bar, or that common standard of adequacy, and having mutual trust in that standard that, say I'm a business associate or data processor, I deliver some service, I could present to a covered entity like a healthcare provider and say, hey, I meet this same standard that you recognize, and we know that that is a common trusted standard that both organizations respect and know it meets and in many cases exceeds the needed levels of information privacy and security. That trust can be established very quickly and enable business, enable healthcare. To me, compliance is at that foundational layer of healthcare, that compliance serves healthcare, not the other way around.
Yeah. And you got a sneak peek of the music selection that's scattered throughout the episodes. And I had a very long, so I listen to a lot of podcasts and a lot of electronic music. So you guys are learning a lot about me. And I told Dylan, our producer, I said, hey, I have this vision. Picture yourself in the elevator of a big building in Blade Runner 2049. What would the music be playing in a Blade Runner 2049 universe elevator? And he gave me some dubstep, so I'll take it.
So you're experiencing what I get to experience, and working with a tremendous innovator like Jeremy. His mind goes in wonderful places, and that's how he creates such wonderful things.
Robert was on, and I was trying to explain to Dylan what I wanted for that next clip and the sound, and I'm talking about like glitch and glitch hop, and Robert's like, just stop. You're showing out.
So yeah, as we go to episode 2, I actually set the stage. So when we talked about the mind map that Jeremy created a minute, we were actually trying to find like what do we actually want to, it's a big deal to like pick a title and a theme and kind of bound what you want to cover. And so we kept coming back to, well, do we want to cover compliance? Do we want to cover security? Do we want to cover assurance? And yes, all those things. But it actually all came back to trust. And so we created this map in our mind that said, let's challenge the concept of trust. Like, are the things that we do actually creating trust and resulting in trustworthy outcomes? Are some of the things we do just because they're the habits and the traditions we have as people that focus on governance, risk, compliance, all those things? And actually, let's make sure we get down to the why, why and how we do that. So we started with compliance because that's where oftentimes the debate is are we creating security outcomes, or are we delivering compliance? And I think, as David said, it's really both. It's creating an assurance that you are achieving the standard necessary to actually deliver the value of security for the system. And then we turned our attention to perception. And the whole notion of perception was, if you're actually talking to the people that you serve and you're talking about trust, what are the things that cause them to perceive that you're trustworthy, or to perceive whether your program has value, or challenge the perception that this is even worth doing? And so we had Mark Nunikoven with us, principal security at AWS, a really deep thinker as well in these topics. And, just in the course of the conversation, we casually got to, I can't remember which of us, brought up the example of going through the airport security, TSA, and, all the things we deal with, taking off my boots every time I go through, and, all of that. And then we got into this concept of security theater. But let's start first with the audiogram, Jeremy, and then here.
Yeah, absolutely. And to set the stage for the audiogram, we were talking about how security people think, and how security people think differently than maybe people that would have to be burdened by thinking these evil thoughts to try to get in the bad guy's head. So let's take a listen to this clip.
Security is based on the assumption that things don't actually work the way we think they do. And really, security is that aspect of making sure that it does continue to work as intended and only as intended. And from the security practitioner perspective, you go, okay, I know all these different things that go wrong. I know all these different types of attacks and things like that. Whereas from that consumer perspective, I think it's almost the opposite. It is just like, yeah, this works. And they assume that that's all that is possible from that. Like you take out a fork and you know what that fork is capable of. You're like, great, I can eat my food with this. It's not a question of like, hey, if I was really evil, what could I do with this fork?
Yeah. So that's the nature and flavor of conversation that we have with Mark. But yeah, to your point, one of the more interesting questions for me was, are security questionnaires a form of security theater?
So, Robert, do you think third-party cybersecurity questionnaires are a form of security theater? Could they be, or could they be implemented in a way that they're not? Do they add value in the way that they are intended to all the time, some of the time, none of the time?
I think, as you know, Jerry, binary questions are hard for me. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it ultimately comes down to what level of assurance does it offer me around the actual effectiveness of the answer. So I would say, you give me an answer, what's the proof behind the answer? If the proof is absent, then I don't know if the answer is real or not. So I would say in that aspect, not much. I think in the aspect of a system that goes beyond the questionnaire, possibly, but then you're into assurance, and there's so much more involved in assurance than just the question and the answer. So yes, probably more security theater in my mind.
I think the challenge with survey questions in general is you got to think of the context of the people answering it. As soon as somebody says, I know I'm supposed to answer this, as opposed to this is my answer. Weird example. You probably figured this out. We've been chatting for a while now. I love weird examples. I read an absolutely bizarrely fascinating breakdown of the smiley face rating system for airport bathrooms. The reason why that's effective is the sheer volume. It's a very simple interaction. It's either 1 to 3, or 1 to 5. Was the bathroom clean and acceptable? Yes or no. Or not yes or no, but 1 to 5. Smiley face happy, no, sticky face green. Individually, they're meaningless because it depends. Somebody could be having a bad day. Most of us traveling are having a bad day. Could be just a bad time before the clean, whatever the case may be. But the point of the system was they gathered just a sheer volume of metrics, gave them enough accuracy, of course, over the trending, that this very subjective measure actually turned into something valuable. And I think the challenge with the survey stuff is it's always scale. We go too deep, too far, and we can't scale it up as broadly as we need to eliminate those biases. Because if you send me a survey question and I know the context of the survey, like, well, I know Jeremy's running the survey and it's about Robert's program and I want Robert to look good. So yes, best answer is going to be given, as opposed to my actual answer is like, oh, Robert really messed up this quarter. Right? And so I'm going to give that because I have a personal connection to Robert and I don't want him to feel bad. And I think that's where things get really muddy.
Yeah, so that's a slice of that conversation. It was pretty long and we covered a fair amount of ground. It was a pretty broad-ranging conversation about how people view security. And our next one was trust versus cloud.
Yeah, so this trust versus the cloud. So does the cloud enable trust? Does it impede trust? Again, and we actually had a great conversation with Jerry Miller at Cloudicity, person really focused not only on just great cloud adoption and the benefits of cloud, but also ensuring trust and great security in the adoption of cloud. And we really, we kind of began with the executive, the executive basis for why people are going to cloud. And so I think let's listen to the audiogram and then we'll get into it. So
there's a growing acceptance across all industries that cloud security is probably better than any one company can do by themselves. If you think about AWS, Azure, Google, they manage millions upon millions of customers globally. And so their security has to encompass the fact that they're servicing so many organizations. And so the scalability of their security is always going to be greater than any one company can do on their own.
Yeah, and I think that this concept of scale and being able to deliver better security because of scale and also, of course, metrics and insights and visibility of the attack surface, all the things that our friends in the cloud service environment can provide, really key. And then it kind of comes back to how does that create scale and value in terms of servicing. So we started with this conversation around is it cost efficiencies? Is it better security? What's the real value of the cloud? And here's the answer he got. So listen.
We tend to see cloud adoption start as a financial exercise, but quickly morph into an agility exercise, because the real benefit of the cloud tends not to be cost savings, which is where companies tend to start. But the real benefit is agility. Like when we brought the first health information exchange onto the cloud, we did that in 2013, I think. And the implementation timeline was 18 months. And we had that thing up and running in production in 6 weeks. When New York State was the hardest hit state with the pandemic, they came to us and said, how many months will it take to build a data lake so that we can get our contact tracing program in place? And we had that up and running in 6 days. And in 6 weeks, they went from being the hardest hit state in the country to the first state to cross green. If you think about financial ROI, the ROI on that project was tens of thousands of people didn't die. So very quickly, organizations start to recognize that the true benefit of cloud is not measured in dollars and cents. It's measured in agility and the ability to move not just twice as fast, but 100 or 1,000 times as fast.
And the participants in this conference won't believe this. We barely, if at all, talked about shared responsibility and inheritance. So I don't know, you don't have to believe that because we talked about it a lot at this conference. But it was more about like the business application of this technology. And it wasn't a commercial for Cloudticity, just like the AWS one wasn't a commercial for AWS. Microsoft, we focused on sort of the concepts, which I was really happy about. It's not sort of a commercial for any particular company, HITRUST included.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this next one, Trust versus Breaches, is our most downloaded episode. Sorry, David, your episode's great. This one happened to get more episodes. And I think it's because of what John told us before we started recording. I reached out to John and knew him through this role, and I have a lot of respect for John as a CISO, and his particular organization acquires a lot of other startup companies and folds them in. And so he gets to interface with other CISOs, and he's sort of a CISO of CISOs in a way. So he gets it, and he's got a lot of experience. And I said, John, would you be willing to like get on the mic with us and talk about breaches? And he said, well, not really. Why not? Well, we can't talk about breaches. No one can talk about breaches. So why? Breaches are sensitive. Okay, well, would you be willing to talk to us about not your breach, but the concept of breaches? Oh, okay, let's get on the mic and talk. And we did, and what it really turned into was like, how do we define a breach? What's it different from a security incident? And stuff like, if there is a breach and you were the CISO, there's this perception of you were incompetent, and it's your incompetence that led to the breach. And is that fair? Maybe it's fair some of the time, but not all the time. And what's the CISO's perspective when that happens, and like sort of the language we use? So let's just know diagram.
When you are talking about that kind of security incident or security event, I think what we've seen over and over again is the companies that try to sweep it under the rug or underplay it, or pretend it isn't a serious issue. Those are the companies that really get sort of castigated in the press down the road. Whereas the companies that are upfront about it and really open about it, as open as they can be, those are the companies that are best able to restore trust, right? I mean, the trust is lost no matter what the situation, but there's a responsibility here to restore that trust with your customers.
Yeah, and one of the things that we tried to do and it didn't work, like we experimented, we started with a Mad Lib, and hey, I'm going to say the first part of a sentence and you finish just to kind of get the conversation going. And it failed, it crashed and burned so much you won't even hear the Mad Lib in the recording. But my Mad Lib was, John, finish the sentence, breaches are blank. And he said, breaches are scary. And I said, okay, that's not a very insightful answer, but it's super true. Let's move on to the rest of the more interesting part of the conversation, which had to do with when there is a security incident, what are the things that a CISO should do to prevent that from becoming front page news? And other practices we can proactively take to detect them faster and stuff like that. And this is just John's a super insightful guy. We were lucky to have him, like we were lucky to have all the guests, but this is a flavor of the way he approaches that question and his overall security program.
When you are a target of choice, that's when you're rolling into the parking lot in your, I don't know, Mercedes or your Explorer, whatever, and an attacker says, that is the vehicle I want to break into. And they will be patient, they will be persistent, they will look for the right opportunity, and they will break into you. And this is where a comprehensive security strategy is important, because look, there are 0 days announced on a regular basis. And if there are 0 days being announced on a regular basis, that means that there are other 0 days upstream in the pipeline, if you will, that we don't know about that attackers do and they're leveraging. So a security program that relies entirely on prevention is not going to be as effective and may come across as incompetent simply because, even though it was a very advanced attack, it went unnoticed. The best approach to protecting yourself and really developing your competence is to have a good preventive program, but also to have that detective program in place that sees that anomalous behavior after access is gained and is able to close it down. That detective side of things is the difference between a security incident where someone gained unauthorized access but didn't make it very far, and a full-on breach where they owned your network for months and operated at will within your network and you never detected them.
Yeah, so great words and great advice, and a good reminder of the foundations of our program. So we had a reprisal of episode 5 earlier this week when we had Chris Hetner join us to talk about the board insights and the recent changes from the SEC, and Dr. Kevin Charest, our Chief Technology Officer and CISO here at HITRUST. And so I'll just play the audiogram you've heard from these gentlemen this week, and we'll kind of tell you the excerpts, which are not what we talked about earlier this week. So there's additional content here I think you'll find interesting. So,
cyber clients regulation does not necessarily translate to effective resiliency. And resiliency is really the centerpiece here. So how do we create resiliency measures to realize that the attack is going to occur, the event's going to happen? What do we put in place in order to recover? There are metrics and measurements that are foundational. We need to have those foundational hygiene measures. So it's having that ability to communicate the relationship between business outcome, the relationship of those exposures to where you have potential integrity issues with your hygiene.
Yeah, and I think that there was a large discussion about our opportunities to become proactive with the board and to bring a conversation. I think what he called ruthless transparency on Tuesday at the first keynote. So I think that's absolutely on point. And so we got into this conversation about the proactive CISO versus the reactive nature of what we do, and take a listen here.
It's an area that's understated, underappreciated, the level of reactiveness that occurs within a cybersecurity organization, particularly within the CISO function. And so what I encourage folks to do, and I've done in the past in my previous roles, and even in my role with the Securities Exchange Commission, working with the U.S. Treasury markets and the financial regulatory bodies, is we've ran a series of exercises. We call them tabletops. We've done drills. We've run different scenarios that introduce the cyber event into the organization. What that does, it provides the training and the muscle when an event occurs and you're in the fight, you're in the battle, that there's an understanding that, wow, we've actually done this. So we're a tabletop now, it's a real-time event, and it's time to execute our management response plan. And I typically lean more towards a crisis management response plan. So again, it diverts the sole responsibility of the event management from the CISO to enterprise risk management to a broader crisis management team. And so you're able to bring in folks such as compliance, public relations, general counsel, outside counsel, and this becomes more of a team sport versus the individual that's proverbial putting out the fire.
And then Kevin spent some time really talking about the expectations of leadership, which we've talked about throughout this week, and specifically as CISOs communicate, interact with their board of directors and the management team. So take a listen.
The board is expecting you to be an expert. That doesn't mean you're supposed to know everything, but they are expecting you to be the expert in the room and to be both competent, capable, but also recognize, generally speaking, we're talking about publicly traded companies and or even privately held, but the reality is the board is there to handle that governance, that oversight of the executive team. And so they're looking for the chief of information security officer to be pragmatic as well, right? So can't walk in with the skies falling. There's always an attack. There's always a new attack. There's always an emerging threat. There's always a crisis du jour, if you will. So what they're looking for, I have found very often, is to understand that you both understand the landscape, but that you also understand that it's a business, and furthermore, that you have the ability, and by you I mean the entire information security structure of a company. It's not embodied in one person, obviously. But then you have the team, the tactics, the procedures, the plans in place to address a myriad, number of threats. So from that standpoint, it's a wonderful opportunity to engage in a really deep conversation about risk and how does cybersecurity risk feed into the whole enterprise risk management as well. And then for those companies that have strong compliance requirements, whether they be from federal or other state, local compliance requirements, you can really paint the picture of how all of that weaves together. But to do that, you have to understand it yourself. And, you have to come equipped to have that dialogue.
Yeah, super lucky to have two good guests there. And we thought it was a rich enough conversation to, again, reprise here. It turned out to be a different conversation. And so just because you might have sat through the keynote on this one, don't feel like this episode's not for you. If you got something out of the keynote of this conference, you take a listen, because it's more of a double click on the concepts that were discussed. I thought this was a great episode. And it had the most catchy title. I'm very proud of this title, Trust versus the Board. I don't think it translated to clicks or downloads, but I think it's a great title anyway. And then with Omar, who we heard from earlier, we ended up having almost 3 different conversations with Omar as I look back at the recording. One was about what we actually set out to talk to him about, which was trust versus third parties and sort of third-party vendor risk management. Before Databricks, Omar was the CISO of a healthcare organization who was successful in sort of integrating the HITRUST assessment process and certifications into his third-party vendor risk management program. He moved on to an AI-focused, data-focused organization. So, of course, we talked about AI, we talked about third parties, and as you heard from our conversation earlier, Omar is very insightful just by way of just leadership and what it takes to be a successful CISO. I want to say he's like adjunct professor of Carnegie Mellon's CISO Institute. So he's got a lot of thinking in that space, and it comes out in conversations with him. This is actually a shorter episode in total, but let's listen to the audiogram.
If I'm going to give you my sensitive data, I want to make sure that you're setting a high bar for yourself. The conversations that I would have with my vendors that would be most concerning were the ones where they would tell me that security is hard. That is the fastest way of eroding trust with your customer, is to tell them it's too hard. And my response to them would be, hey, if you're telling me it's too hard, it's too expensive for you to adequately protect my data in the way that I and my customers expect it to be protected, I think you might be in the wrong business.
Yeah, and so part of the editing process is taking an hour-long conversation and turning it into sometimes a 20-minute conversation. And when I showed Robert and the rest of the team, here's what I think we need to focus on and make the episode, Robert said, what? There's too much in here that was really, it was a good conversation. So bonus for everyone in this room right now, you get to hear some stuff that we cut, not because we didn't love it, but just it didn't fit into the third-party episode. So I really like this story. It's the longest clip in here, but I thought it was a great story to share with you all. So take a listen. Hopefully you agree.
In my security team, I had a rule that anytime someone came to me and they asked me for money for a technology, a vendor, or an acronym, it was automatically denied. And the idea behind that is, the goal isn't to deploy EDR, the goal isn't to deploy DLP, the goal isn't to deploy SASE or CSPM, or, I feel like we've upgraded security from 3-letter acronyms to 4-letter acronyms. That's the big progress we've made in the last few years. But that's not the goal. The goal is to deploy those to do something with them. Like, what are you trying to do? What is the outcome that you're actually trying to achieve? And so for me, that becomes how I sort of back into the system is tell me what the outcome is, and then let's figure out what the system, what the elements are that we need to go deliver that outcome. I'd gotten really excited. I was a new CISO, and I thought I should go tell the board that we deployed a WAF. And of course, you know, the board being made up of very kind gentlemen and ladies, they all said, good job, yet they had absolutely no idea what a WAF was or why it was important, but they figured if the CISO's excited, we should be excited for him. And years later, a couple years later, we had a situation where we'd identified our customer had identified a vulnerability in one of our applications. And I'd said to the team, well, this is pretty simple. If we should go get this vulnerability remediated. The application team came back and said, you know what, this is going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a couple months. We've got to do unit testing, and it's really complicated. I said, well, no big deal. That's what we have the WAF for. We can virtually patch it and identify if anyone tries to exploit it and block it at the perimeter. So that's why we have the WAF. Team comes back and says, Amar, we can't do that. I said, well, fine. If you can't block it, at least put it in monitor-only mode. So if someone attempts the exploit, it's not blocked, but we get to at least know that something's happening. We'll page someone in the middle of the night, and before something really bad happens, we can address it. Worst case, we'll just shut down the application. Yeah, I can live with that risk. They come back, boss, we can't do that either. But what do you mean you can't do that? Is, you know, this application not being monitored, blocked by the WAF? And they're like, no, it's not. And I'm like, okay, which applications are? Because this feels like an important application to have been monitored and blocked by the WAF. And they said, oh, none of them are. I'm like, but didn't we deploy the WAF and high five and tell the board and celebrate? They're like, yeah, because you told us we needed to deploy a WAF, and we did deploy a WAF. And so I realized early on that security people and technologists are literalists. So when you say deploy the technology, that's what they mean. Deploy the technology, turn it on, and it's deployed, not have the technology deliver real, meaningful value and outcome to the business. And so I said, I'm not going to play these games anymore. No one's ever going to talk about WAF. We're just going to talk about, in this context, how are you better protecting the applications and how many of them and what are you doing? And now I don't really care about the technology. I care about the outcomes. So for me, that's sort of become a central thing is what are the actual outcomes you're going to deliver, and can I convey and articulate them in a way that a business leader would look at and hear and say, that sounds like a good thing to do. And they're not only saying it because they're trying to be nice to me.
Yeah, it's such a cool story, and it's the flavor of conversations with guests that we had throughout the season. It felt really genuine in a way that I didn't expect, and we got to learn a lot about or people. Omar has been on the board of HITRUST for a long time. I had a lot of conversations with Omar. I thought I knew him, and I just got to see a completely different side of him. And John, for example, we heard from earlier on the Breaches episode, amazing photographer, and we kicked off the episode about, you know, is security anything like photography? And we just get to learn so much more about, you know, people that we might see and hear from, and just in a different way. I was very privileged to have these kind of conversations, and it feels like a privilege that we have the technology to share them in a way that hopefully it's not only a little bit entertaining, but somewhat insightful and helps you a little bit.
Yeah, indeed. Just tremendously blessed to have the opportunity. So we'll turn our attention to episode 7 with another member of the HITRUST board, George DeCesare from Kaiser Permanente. George has a role of, is it enterprise risk leadership?
Chief Technology Risk Officer.
Chief Technology Risk Officer. I'm sorry, I should remember that. But what's really interesting about his role, and I've always enjoyed in my conversations with George, is that he is, you know, the CISO reports to him. The function that I've traditionally led is there, but he also is looking at the overall technology risk landscape for a very large, very complex, multi-state health system. And you know, so we elevated the conversation from trust versus things in the purely security realm or compliance realm to how does security fit into the enterprise risk landscapes. Let's take a listen to the audiogram.
Yeah, if you don't change your process before you invest in the technology, then you're just kind of adding layers on top of broken things. And if you don't reap the benefits of what you invested in, meaning, you know, it doesn't provide efficiency, it doesn't provide speed, it doesn't provide things that you see as a benefit to
this investment and that's not delivered, that's a risk. The risk to an organization is a part of the risk to the industry. Because if you have a failure in the health system, it's going to impact everybody else.
Yeah, and so I think, and by the way, we heard from more than half of our guests about enterprise or organizational risk as an important dimension of this whole universe that we manage in. And so I just think George, given his role, was very clearly placed to be the one that we would anchor that discussion on. And so we were actually trying to contrast what is enterprise risk possibly versus a risk in a component or a dimension or a element of the enterprise risk. And George told us this great story. I'd actually heard it before from another individual, but it was a real reminder of the fact that we are a system and enterprise risk is a systemic problem. So take a listen here.
I use, there's a gentleman that I've worked with in the past by the name of Bob Zuckus. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's written a number of books, former PwC gentleman. And one of his stories that I've gone to our board and talked about is, understand what your O-ring is. By that, it's the story about the Challenger space shuttle mission. What happened in that explosion, that accident. And it turned out to be a small, tiny little O-ring that was subjected to, I think it was lower temperatures or higher temperatures, I can't recall. Then it was tested by a few degrees, but that caused a systemic failure of all of the shuttle systems. Similarly, it's like in healthcare, you kind of have to understand what is that O-ring, what's tied together, and there's a lot. You look at who you do business with, you look at what you do, you look at in the care delivery space, you've got legacy clinical systems that don't have the capability of accepting agents or being monitored. So you've got all these things that come together as your O-ring, and which one can cause a systemic failure in your environment. You have financial situations, those are right now something that healthcare is looking at. Sure that the leaders in that space are looking at the industry as a whole and saying, what can we do better so that we don't fail? So those are things that would come down across the board, are systemic in nature, and cybersecurity is a piece of that can cause a failure if there is an impact to that environment. So there's quite a, from my perspective and what I do is I'd have to look at that holistically and be able to determine what pieces fit together, where that O-ring sits, which O-rings we have throughout our environment, and which ones we have to deal with. Again, everything has a cost. To accept a risk because that cost versus the benefit isn't just equal or greater.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about a lot this week here at the Collaborate conference, and a lot of what I think I've tried to say in some of my sessions is the discussion around the system of risk around everything we do. And we use terms like third-party risk. We talk about relying parties. We talk about our assessors and their role in helping all of us be secure. It's ultimately because regardless of which organization you sit in, when it all comes together, it's a system. And I think the example George gave us was a real reminder of, asking yourself the question, if I look across my system, or even if it's a small system, what are those points of vulnerability, those O-rings, those places that, if stressed, are going to cause the whole system to be at risk?
Yeah, absolutely. And he talked about sort of acceptance of risk. And the follow-up question was, is accepting the risk, does that become a risk in and of itself if there's a lot of risk acceptance in your vendor supply chain that you don't really, maybe didn't have the insight into? Really rich conversation in this space. It's titled to enterprise risk, and I think we kind of straddled enterprise risk and cyber risk very well and touched a lot upon both.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so our final episode of the season, episode 8, we actually interviewed Sophia, the AI robot, and my first question was, when is the end of days coming and what will it look like? It was a really rich conversation. Just kidding. It was a montage episode, and the format was something I wanted to do for every single episode, but it proved to be difficult in a number of ways. We asked every single individual that we interviewed a very similar question. What are your thoughts on how AI is going to change our work and our industry? And here's the audiogram.
And of the past, I don't know, 5, 10 years, there's these waves
just like all of those waves, this wave I'm talking about, yeah, the volume's a little low, so I can't stop it. So it's like 20 more seconds, sorry. But here I am pontificating about the Jetsons-like future that was promised in like 2016, 2017, whenever the last AI media hype came through, and we didn't get it, and how sad I was that as a knowledge worker, I still have to work the way I did in 2014 and 2015. Yeah, and also here I'm saying I'm floored because it feels different now, in the sense that we now, compared to 2014, 2015, 2016, we now have got AI sort of playgrounds and sandboxes to play in. And like personally, I was floored when I saw ChatGPT write some code in a language that I can code in, and it commented the code way better than I would have commented the code. And not only that, it explained how to open the integrated development environment and launch the code and run it. I'm floored by the current capability. And I started by saying I didn't want to even talk about AI on the podcast because it's impossible to miss AI in every other podcast that I listen to. And maybe your experience like that as well. We actually talked to David again this episode. It's a clip from David's episode 1. And I want to say we have 3 or 4 other clips. And this is one from John's episode on breaches where we had said, John, how will AI change the breach landscape?
Actually, a question from our earlier session.
Unfortunately, say we will 100% see an increase in breaches. Those breaches, though, won't necessarily be nefarious actors. Those are going to be breaches where where the compliance team finds out that a member of the company leveraged AI to analyze data, and they shared confidential information with that AI solution. That's where I think we're going to see the breaches. I think the HIPAA wall of shame is going to be on fire with announcements over the next 2 years or so. I think we'll see similar things happening around financial information and so forth. So I see that happening. Will our defenses improve? Yeah. I mean, in fact, I was just looking at a solution from my former employer, Microsoft, which will scan data. It uses AI to scan data to look for PII. Right, so it's doing more than just a simple grep or a regex. It's actually using artificial intelligence to recognize PII. Tools like that can really help us.
Yeah. So that was a fun conversation. It opened, I think it aired like last week.
Last week, yes.
Very, very recently. I re-listened to it on the way here. It's one of my favorites. I recommend you check it out. I don't think we give enough airtime to AI in this security conference. And so if you need your AI fix from HITRUST perspective before you leave, your favorite podcast app, you know where to get it.
Excellent.
Yeah, and so at the risk of like, how when you go to grandma's house and she's like, your grandfather and I went to the Grand Canyon and let's pull out the projector and look at every single photo that they took. We're not going to do that. I've got clips if we need them. But we want to hit some of the themes that that appeared across all episodes just naturally, briefly. Robert?
Yeah, I think we had this conversation several times about vendor security questionnaires, and it really was around the how much reliance we can put in those. And I think the general gist of the feedback was they're not necessarily bad, but the conversation is always like, how much confidence can you have in the objectivity, the objectivity of the answers you receive? And so really comparing and contrasting different ways of thinking about validation and assurance, and questionnaire is kind of one end of that spectrum. So
yeah. Well, and I think we touched on a lot of these themes, and I'm scared to press next because it may play the audio, and we'll be here and we'll all miss our flights. So the title of this presentation is Trust versus Have We Found the Answer? Robert, have we found the answer? Has 8 hours of conversation and 55,000 downloads episode in number 18 in Pakistan? Have we reached the answer?
I think we've just started asking the questions. So no, we've reached a lot of answers. I think the thing that was really encouraging was the level of consensus and common views across leadership. Lots of experts looking at the problem in a similar way. We have a common vocabulary as an industry now. We've learned how to be leaders in this space. I think a lot of these individuals are paving the way. You've heard from several of them this week. So yes, I think we found a lot of the answers. I think there's many more questions that need to be asked.
Yeah, and I think we're lucky enough to work in a field where sometimes all you can do is appreciate the question, but sometimes you find that other very smart people are way down the field and helping get that question answered. The tools available, like we just talked about, for DLP, AI-based DLP, AI-based malware detection, AI-based heuristic scanning and stuff like that, I think goes a long way. But hopefully we're at a stage now in cybersecurity that we're doing more than just appreciating the nuanced aspects of the question itself. So should there be a season 2? That's the question for me right now. I'm not sure if we will have a season 2. And the reason why is because podcasts are a weird thing, as I've come to learn. It's difficult to say, what is the ROI on a podcast? This is a true story. I was an intern at Grant Thornton public accounting firm, and I don't know, I'm not going to say the year. I was 2 years in, so I'd just become a senior associate, and I had raised my hand and said, I listen to a web design podcast, and I learn a lot about web design. And I went to our chief marketing officer as a senior associate of a number 6 CPA firm, and I said, we need a podcast. And she said, okay, I've heard about podcasts, but I've never listened to one. Podcasts hadn't been big yet. And her first question was, what is the ROI of this podcast? And I said, I'll get back to you. And I never got back to her because I couldn't figure it out as a senior associate. And it's still difficult to answer now. And so is there an ROI in terms of the amount of time we spent, the amount of return we get? Not financially, but I think we get some return.
Yeah.
It's a very rich experience, which hopefully we've got a slice of in this conversation.
Yeah, I think, and I hope to hear from you all, because the return on the investment of time is, does it add value for each of you? And are we exploring topics that are interesting? Are we giving you ideas, hearing from people how they communicate on these same challenges and issues? So I'm pretty bullish there will be a season 2, but we've got some work to do to kind of plan what that looks like. And we have your mind map still, Jeremy, so we have all kinds of things we can explore.
There may be an episode of HIPAA security rule 25 years later, what's changed and what's not. I think that might be a cool episode for the 3 of us that think that's an interesting topic.
Yeah, so.
Yeah. What are some other topics that we've got ideas for?
Well, you gave me a list, so you prepared me for that question. So I think, the concept of what is good enough security. So with air quotes around it, like trust versus good enough. Are there, we had a couple of conversations about accepting risk, and when is it appropriate to accept a risk? I kind of see that in the same place, like good enough, not good enough. Threats and vulnerabilities always out there. I think we can get much more specific on AI, because I think we're starting to see the risk landscape, certain topics where we could dig deep into some themes that a lot of organizations might be having to think about. So there are things like that. So.
Yeah, trust versus edge computing. Selfishly, because I want to learn more about edge computing, and it's a great way to dive deep into the topic, and maybe you all can learn about edge computing as well. But the ask that I have, if you think this is at all interesting, please let us know. You could catch us after, and Blake over there has the marketing budget, so please tell Blake how much you love the podcast. Or if you want to leave a review of maybe a podcast episode that they really liked in whatever platform you listen to the podcast on, it would go a long way. And just kind of tell your coworkers that maybe this particular episode is better than that one. That kind of stuff helps us, move forward. So another ask, in addition to letting us know you want season 2, if you do, is to go check out the episodes of season 1 that you might have missed. Like I said, they're all available: Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, wherever you get your podcasts. They are free to download, and they are commercial free.
Commercial free.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Jeremy, for joining us on the journey. It's great.
Thank you.